Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here today. I would like to introduce our speaker. Today's speaker is from Spain, Barcelona. We have Professor Pepa Moran Nunez. Sorry if I butcher your name.
No problem.
Give you a little bit of background on her work. She's both architect and landscape architect, practicing the profession and also teaching at the Department of Urbanism, Territory and Landscape at the School of Architecture at the Polytechnical University of Catalonia, so in Barcelona. She's also coordinator there of the Master in Landscape Architecture. I've had the opportunity to meet her at the last IFLA conference, which is the World Conference of Landscape Architects. She was presenting some work related to disturbance into landscapes and fire disturbance landscape. And I was, afterward I discovered that was a really research topic and the base of many international projects she has carried out. Also the Horizon project in 2020, I was reading on a paper. So she's also board member of an important foundation, the Pau Costa Foundation, which dedication is about increasing awareness and knowledge about fire risk management. So as a climate change and we are more and more exposed to the extreme weather condition and fire are shaping our landscape, the US is also included in this process of change. And we as designer, we are very much engaged in thinking how we can interact or make it coexisting a fire with a shaping of the landscape. So Professor Pepa Moran definitely will provide an interesting base for the discussion and, let's say, inspiration for our research. So we welcome you and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Irene Curuli. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to share with you the following presentation. This is the presentation I'm going to give you is part of my professional, academic, and research work. And as Professor Curuli was mentioning, I presented this presentation I'm going to introduce you in the IFLA Congress, in the International Federation of Landscape Architecture Congress. So I'm going to share the screen. So the title is Disrupted Affections Wildfire in Mediterranean Landscapes. This research I'm going to introduce you is due to the disturbances we are dealing with in the Mediterranean landscapes. In Southern Europe, we have had the worst wildfire in decades. France has been suffering the last summer its largest wildfire in at least 50 years. And in Spain, we had about 100,000 hectares burned last summer, most of them in the northwest, with a perimeter of 900 kilometers. 90% of them originated accidentally. In 2017, in Pedro Grau wildfires in Portugal, there were about 60 people that lost their lives. So the international community on wildfire management recognizes the inability of resolve the problem strictly from the field of emergencies. This is a landscape in its full complexity problem. We cannot deal with these issues thinking that we are facing a strictly ecological, social, or economical problem. So I would like to start with certain paradoxes that we have been facing. A paradox is a statement or a situation that may be true, but seems impossible or difficult to understand because it contains two opposite facts or characteristics. I'd like to start with one of the most interesting paradoxes for me when I face it, from Mark Finney. He's a researcher in California, and he was explaining this paradox. We have taken an ecosystem that was maintained by fire into an ecosystem destroyed by fire. For me, it's important to start with this sentence and as well with my students, because here fire or wildfire has two positions very different. One is the maintenance of an ecosystem, but it can be as well a force that destroys the ecosystem. So why are we facing this paradox, which is this situation that is so complex? So one of these paradoxes, the extinction paradox, has been recognized by the community of wildfire extinction. And over the last decade, large wildfires with extreme behavior have affected many world regions. During this time, the response has been focused on strengthened fire suppression policies. So this is like the result of many years on extinction policies. And quoting a researcher called Xantopoulos, he explains that the heavy investment reduced fires of medium and low intensity, while the more intense wildfires continued to spread beyond suppression capacities. This is a paradox because how can it be that the reduction of low and medium intensity wildfires paradoxically ensure the persistence of high intensity wildfires? This is something that happened in some of most important risks. That is that we face two small and medium situations, but when we reduce these situations or these wildfires, the problem is even bigger because it's like a negative selection of fires. While landscape has not this reduction of biomass through low and medium wildfires, and in these situations, the big fires, the large fires are even bigger, so these are not able to be extinguished. So we are facing this first extinction paradox, but as well we are facing a paradox in prevention. The prevention is facing a situation which is quoting Ana Badia. These are some examples of extreme fire behavior, the ones that I was telling you that it's a negative selection of fires. But related to prevention paradox, quoting Ana Badia, some current responses from prevention in these wildland urban interfaces, for example, this image is a landscape characterized by a wildland urban interface, which is this mixture between urban development and forest density forest areas. In these environments, they arise from an approach based mainly on specific wildfire prevention infrastructures. For example, this area in Catalonia, there was a perimeter management strip related to the neighborhood, which was about 25 meters wide. And this strip very often doesn't respond to the potential of wildfire from the place, giving a false sense of security, but also being specific infrastructures which their goal is prevention rather than multifunctionality, which means that they are not self-sufficient infrastructures. They are basically done through and bottom-down mechanism from a mandatory regulation. So this is the second paradox we are facing, but as well we have recognized the resilient paradox. David Robbins describes suburban developments as a mental paradigm. This is an example of urban sprawl very close to Barcelona, in the metropolitan area of Barcelona. This concept is the suburbanization of the imagination. It is neither city nor countryside. The suburb is a space where traffic and trees coexist, generating an imaginary made between the two, which are not related. Many forest landscapes surrounding urbanization are highly resilient to fire, while in contrast, urbanizations in these locations are very vulnerable to fire, reaching a high degree of affectation of people and material goods. This paradoxical contrast between high resilience in the forest and very low resilience in the urbanized areas are one of the biggest challenges that wildfire scenario is facing, as well as landscape planning. This is a map of Catalonia we have developed in the project that Professor Curuli was mentioning, the fire res. And in Catalonia, the most vulnerable landscapes coincide with the most populated and dispersed urban areas, mainly in the metropolitan areas of Barcelona and in the coastline. Here in the left, you can see the highest degree of vulnerability. You can see it is located mostly in this coastal area and the most populated areas. People living in the wild urban interfaces, which this is a specific word for this kind of urban developments, establish their main relations, social and cultural relationships with other distant environments where services and facilities are located. For example, this is a map of actors and landscape and their relations through a territory. And in these wildland urban interfaces, the relationships with the social and cultural links between people and services are not in their neighborhood itself, but in the surroundings, and neither with the forest that surrounds it. This is something very special and specific in these environments. This is a classification linking vulnerability and sites, or the sites of suburban areas in the metropolitan area of Barcelona. And in the left, you can see this is the highest vulnerability, and in the top, the biggest surface. And if we are focused in one of the areas, for example, in Camp Aulet, these suburban areas, there is a clear definition between urban and non-urban areas, but forest doesn't read these limits and enters as a material continuum in the residential area. For example, you can see here how fire would spread through the residential area. And even though that the planning and definition creates a very sharp bound between what is urban and what is non-urban, fire doesn't read it. Ecology definition is rooted in the relationship of living organisms to one another and to their physical environment. As Botkin and Lister suppose, landscape and ecology are connected through and are defined by the concept of relationship, the quality of which is mutable and dynamic. But the ecological relationship between these two landscapes that we were seeing, the urban and the forest, is continuous and is materially related. The emotional, productive, or economic relationship between both landscapes is practically non-existent. This image shows, for example, some of the installations of future plots for developing urban areas or dwellings. And this is the relation that is already in this place. This is a place thought for future development. This is like the photo is showing right now. So as we can see, wildfire doesn't read this kind of limits that urbanism creates in a paper, which is the difference between an urban area and a non-urban area. So we are facing a social ecological disconnection. Instead, fire is a relational phenomenon by itself. Let's learn from wildfire. So if we should make two questions for us as landscape architects is, what can we learn from wildfires? as landscape architects, and what is our missions as landscape architects in this issue. I would like to start from this quote or this sentence from Event Regime, because the news, the media focus on the event, the day zero. How can we transcend through landscape architecture, day zero, and integrate other temporalities? Wildfires like flooding, avalanches, and other disturbances operate through time and are characterized by intensity and frequency defining regime. As Barbara Adams explains in Timescape of Modernity, temporal perception is required to understand disturbances. This is a day zero cartography exploration from one of the most important mountain range in the metropolitan area of Barcelona, which is the Collserola mountain range. And it shows how it would be the landscape after a wildfire and a structural wildfire. On one hand, we feel a direct bond with these landscapes. We feel affect, a recognition of values and caring, but on the other hand, we feel affected by them. We feel loss and perceived damage. Oh, our wildfire perception is both sociocultural and disruptive. So after focusing on another dimension of time, which would involve regime, another aspect we would like to enhance is what burns. Very often we hear, and we are facing many scientific information about fire spread, that the concept fuel is very present. But in landscape, what burns goes from fuel to values. The concept of landscape is a sociocultural construction conceptualized from a system of values, as Simon Schofield affirms, and constructed through society and culture. We cannot separate wildfire from the landscape that burns. Fire is signified through the impact it entails. These are examples of landscape value cartographies, recognizing these elements that we enhance their value and are attached to. These examples of value cartographies are the first step to recognize what can be vulnerable to wildfire. A third concept would be integrate events, mitigate effects. For us, wildfires are in the past very often, and in the future, in the past in our memory, and in the future as a threat or a risk. It is our challenge to integrate them in the present. These are some examples of our students working on recognizing how fire is spreading in a territory. And these are what we call homogeneous wildfire behavior polygons. This is a methodology created by the Catalonia Wildfire Extinction Service. And through the last year, about 10 years ago, we have integrated the Catalan Wildfire Extinction Service into our academic and research experience and seminars. Rotherman, one of the most, or the pioneers who have integrated wildfire into research, answered the question of whether it is possible to predict the behavior of wildfires, saying, "This depends on how accurate we expect the answer to be." As Wire exposes, adding more precise information about risk does not necessarily contribute to solving the problem, but rather to adding more complexity. We are dealing with uncertainty in wildfires. So these kind of representations are trying to reduce or to handle uncertainty and integrating it through probability. So this is something we are going to be facing with when we are dealing with disturbances. And this is a way of integrating this uncertainty into cartographies and decision-making in landscape architecture. For example, here you can see some of the areas which are the most vulnerable. And to determine it, to recognize it, we need to know as well which is the capacity of the resilience of the landscape, how much it is affected by fire, and which is their capacity to overcome or have a resilience or resistance response. For example, this is, well, I would like to mention something in this area. This cartography represents this vulnerability in the Cocherola mountain range. We could ask ourselves as well whether it is casual that the most vulnerable areas in terms of social facilities, public space, as well as energy and food dependency, are as well the most wildfire vulnerable territories. We can return again to the relational question. The most vulnerable areas are those in which there are many values and assets, as we see in these cartographies, but at the same time, the greatest accumulation of fuel. This is explained by the unexisting relationship between these two landscapes and the dependency of the urban area to other territories. In the fire res, in the Horizon 2020 project, we have developed an operational guide to integrate wildfires into landscape planning, in which we have as well gathered examples of planning and design best practices. This is an example of a project we developed with the Pau Costa Foundation, and it is a project trying to integrate the recognition of environmental, social, and infrastructural vulnerabilities in the Barcelona forest neighborhoods. It was done by a multidisciplinary team of sociologists, engineers, and landscape architects, emphasizing the communication and self-preparedness to neighbors and communities. For example, we were using some of these artificial intelligence, virtual reality as a technology that can explain and integrate certain scenarios into the communication and self-preparedness of neighborhoods. Another concept that for me is one of the most important concepts to integrate into the design process is to reveal the capacities of landscape that are activated through a wildfire. For example, here, these images show how an ecosystem activates its strategies and recover after a fire. You can see different phases on the recovery, the resprouting, some aerial parts, recolonization of seeds, dominance of a specific species. And this is an image of a shrub area of Quercus coccifera 1 month after a wildfire. As Moreira and Castelnau explains, wildfires are fundamental elements in the creation and management of Mediterranean landscape and ecosystem. Here you can see the change of the landscape that we are facing, for example, in Catalonia. We had, in the beginnings of the 20th century, an average of 15% of forest coverage, and now we have a 67% of forest coverage. Due to social, economical, and cultural changes in land use, there has been an increase of the size and severity of forest fire, which has changed the regime. So here you can see very, very well how our own dynamics, all the cultural dynamics and socio-economical dynamics are changing the regime of wildfire, and how much are we interacting with this kind of dynamics. For example, in this example, we can see how the cultivated area has been reduced from 47% in 1956 to a 5% in 2018, and forest has increased from 21% to 53%. This generate a change of regimes in terms of wildfire, creating a much more intense scenario, which is the scenario we are facing just now. The forest composition in these landscapes is, as we were saying before, is an example of adaptability. Fire is integrated from their own pyroecology. Many of these species, Pinus alepensis, Boxifera, Quercusilex, they regenerate after a wildfire through strategies, for example, resprouting or germination, which provide communities with high resilience to fires. These examples are some cartographies done from, it's a sequence. This would be the resilience capacity of landscape the first year after a wildfire, and this would be 5 years afterwards. Understanding landscape capacities reveals to understand them and to integrate in the project, it's one of the most important concepts as the idea of working in coalition with them. The most vulnerable areas in this landscape are the urban infrastructures and the wildland urban areas, which are very sensitive to wildfires and have minimal adaptability. So if we remember the first cartography we have seen about the post-fire cartography, the day zero, and now we see that 5 years afterwards, these communities have this potential of resilience capacity. This should be absolutely taken into consideration in landscape approach and planning. Resignify loss and permanence. This is an example of Galicia forest landscape 3 months after a wildfire. You can see ferns and oaks resprouting. As Keith Ansel Pearson, a philosopher that I really recommend the lecture of his books, as he exposes in his book Germinal Life, nature and vegetation and its transformability goes beyond that of a passive adapter, and it extends to the survival of the species beyond the individual. Vegetation integrates change into its becoming. It is intrinsic to the condition of being alive. Recognizing on fire the capacity of awakening the system and accelerating its dynamics endows fire with a creative and transformative characteristics. Going beyond the event to the regime, we signify wildfire through affection. These are some examples also gathered in the guide of one project I really recommend to have a look and to review from Michael van Valkenburg Associates. It is a garden called General Mill Headquarters. This project is pioneer in integrating controlled burning as a managed practice for an unconventional and radical aesthetic experience. As well, we have another project called the Crosby Arboretum, made by Anthropogon Associates. In this project, it is introduced the use of fire to establish and maintain specific native plant communities as a key tool in ecological management. The Arboretum integrates visits and research in its program and areas. Quoting Elizabeth Meyer, aesthetic perception requires an exchange, a perceptual entanglement between a sensing body and the world. The aesthetic experience allows us, through affection, to recognize capabilities beyond appearance and standards of beauty, incorporating the disruptive. But what about design, and how can we integrate these disturbances? What kind of wildfire is this landscape? Now, I hope that you have already linked strongly the concept of wildfire to landscape. This diagram is the representation of a landscape in evolution in a specific moment, is this rectangle, for example. But as well, we can understand that we are just in this rectangle in the upper part, but this landscape comes from an evolution by itself. So we cannot think about a landscape as a fixed frame, but we have to think about this landscape means an evolution, maybe from an agricultural landscape, afterwards an abandoned area, and through succession to a mixed forest. So the scale of the fire and the meaning of the fire is the meaning of the landscape that it burns. The degree of impact of the fire is the degree of the impact of the values that we lose. We could say that if the question is fire, the answer is landscape. I'm going to show you a video. This is a work from our students trying to explore the capacity of wildfires in the landscape and their transformability. One moment. So as you have seen, management itself introduces a disruptive but frequent and low intensity change. Some authors, as Nigel Dunnett and James Luken in the book Dynamic Landscape, refer to it as design disturbance. Management is like a design disturbance, where the boundary between disturbance and management is questioned. So more than a question of how it burns, it's rather whether it burns. This is also a question of how it burns rather than whether it burns or not, or the degree of change that the landscape is able to absorb. So other examples of projects as is one of I would like to enhance. This is a collaborative project from the administration and the Fire Extinction Service, and it proposes an ecological fire flood. This is the creation of Medfire model to simulate wildfire behavior, and the proposal consists on managing wildfire, not managing fire as prescribed burning, but wildfire, during extinction operations, deciding, choosing where to let it burn or not. These are some examples of wildfire management. Another example, for example, here you can see what would be the management versus disturbance. In a forest without management, wildfire has a special severity and intensity, but through management, we can modulate wildfire because the degree of change and the disturbance has been introduced not only through management, but also by wildfire. So this is a way of modulating change and modulating disturbance in landscape through management. This is an example of a management diagram. As Wunder exposes, adaptive management has the ability to interact with existing dynamics and increase biodiversity and system resilience based on learning by doing. Another example of integrating management, for example, through grazing, is this project developed by the Pau Costa Foundation, which combines silvopastoralism and fire prevention through grazing in Catalan forest areas. The Ramats de Foc fire herds promotes the continuity of livestock activity in the territory and the recognition of ecosystem services that extensive livestock farming provides to society. They have already as well created kind of recognition, like a trademark called Ramats de Foc, and people consuming products from nearby herds contribute to creating and maintaining these landscapes adapted to fire. Fire Wine is an European-funded project, as well developed in FireRes Horizon 2020, and they are as well working with actors in the territory, wine producers, and adopting fire-smart land management. In Catalonia, even smoke-exposed grapes are being turned into bifumat, which means smoke wine, a wine that tells a story of innovation and integrates wildfire as a flavor. The project has developed 2 trademarks aimed at the wine value chain and other primary products. Another concept related as well with project would be protecting dynamics to protect values. Here we can see a matrix of management. In the upper level, you see which are the areas that has been managed, and these are like 4 scenarios. First scenario is 5% of management. You see underneath how much permanence of value would be after a fire. So there would be a lot of affection or loss of value, loss of value, that you can see in the lower level. In the different scenarios, we can see that the more we integrate strategic management, the higher we can maintain value and reduce their loss. So there is a specific, like the most efficient scenario would be the 25% because it contributes to a greater value with less energy. This is something very important to recognize because very often we are not going to be able to manage everything, but we can recognize which is the most efficient scenario in our design approach. Landscape architecture plays a fundamental role in the construction of value. Here you can see, for example, the recognition of which was the dynamics to arrive to a specific point in the history of a landscape. And here you can see some images created by an artist called Andrés Marín Jarque from the Museum of Ethnology in Valencia. And I like very, very much this kind of drawings because they are showing how a landscape is activated and creates certain activities because of the use and the people that were living in these landscapes. For example, this image is relating the activity of a shepherd, the tools that he's using or she is using, and all the economy as well that would be related to this landscape. As well, we find the same characteristical image with the creation of coal. And this is an example of one of the most important changes in Mediterranean landscapes. Why has the forest grown so much during the years since the 1950? I would like to see your faces and ask you directly because it's one of the questions I very usually do to my students. And of course, it's due to an energetic cause, an energetic change. We were using forest for coal, for charcoal, and now we are not using them anymore because we are using fossil fuel. So it has created an huge change in our relation to landscapes as well. Now our relation, as this image shows, it's much more a relation of perception, visit, much more specific in time, not so much interlink as before. Here's another project that I would like as well to mention because now we are facing a very interesting situation. Now we are facing to democratizing certain decision making on wildfires, and this is an example of this kind of dynamics. The project is co-created by agents of the landscape with different knowledges, working together and giving values to their landscape. Providing a strategic management criteria to the extinction of a fire. If we know that specific areas are really high valuable, and we have arrived to this conclusion through a democratization process, we can face a wildfire with the socializing this decision that the extinction service is going to take in an emergency. This is as well a project about democratizing this kind of decision making in an extinction process in the Eastern Moors. And what can we do as well from landscape architecture or landscape planning? These are some examples of multifunctional infrastructures that we have been developing in the metropolitan area of Barcelona. And these multiple infrastructures can contribute to add social and cultural value, as well to enhance resistance and resilience towards wildfire. These green infrastructures can become, as well, protective infrastructures, and protective infrastructures, as we have been mentioning before, as the stripes we were mentioning, could become green infrastructures, enhancing resilience through multifunctionality. Going back to our urbanization case study, reducing other vulnerabilities, the ones that we were recognizing through dependence of energy, dependence of food production on other areas, etc., or urban livability, this can contribute indirectly to mitigate wildfire risk. These are examples of social relations cartographies, the nodes, the flows, the visibilities. And this is an example of activating social relations between landscapes. We have a paradigm in landscape that is, for example, an agricultural field. An agricultural field is at the same time a productive, an ecological, a social, and a cultural landscape feature. Protective infrastructure can become something more than protective to be efficient. In this sense, landscape architecture and planning are transformative agents that integrate wildfire mitigation as an indirect objective. Here, for example, we are proposing in this example physical transformations related to all the other vulnerabilities that this urban area is facing. They are, as I was telling you, energetic dependent. They are basically fossil fuel dependent. They are food production dependent on other communities, maybe 20 kilometers far from them. They have not fire-wise facilities. Their housing livability is very reduced. So through enhancing these vulnerabilities, we can integrate indirectly the protection or the mitigation to wildfires. This is an example of how we integrate management through in the areas that are proposed to be reduced their vulnerability to wildfire. Other examples of projects that integrate practices as prescribed burning. Prescribed burning is a traditional, the integration of fire as a tool of management is an ancestral practice, but now we call it prescribed burning when it is done and it is used by professionals as firefighters. And for example, in this case study in the live taiga, prescribed burning in the Swedish taiga has traditionally been carried out to ensure pastures and grazing as an activity, while forest management's primary objective was to serve as an energy source prior to the imposition of fossil fuels. The influence of reducing the severity of wildfires was an indirect issue, and now to integrate and increase biodiversity, the objective of the clue has been creating this integration of prescribed burning for biodiversity in taiga forests. And finally, as one of the a synthesis of a concept, we would return to this idea of relational opportunity. After a disturbance such as fire, there has been an impact, and it is time to transform that impact into affection, into relationship. The very definition of fire and affect includes disruption in description. For example, in this project in Safe Village, Safe People in Portugal, it focused on post-fire landscapes. Safe villages improve protective infrastructures as fire-resistant buildings. And if, for example, in Aldea Modelo, this project we are having here, this project works on consolidating fragmented land holding and integrating fire management in traditional local practices, such as grazing, forestry management, and agriculture. People and communities after a fire, they are open to re-signify fire and their relation to their landscape. This is an example of the areas. We are in a new relational paradigm, or we have the opportunity to integrate this, to be integrated in this new relational paradigm. As Felix Watery exposes, social ecology will have to work towards rebuilding human relations at every level of the socials. Firefighting services have been pioneers in recognizing their own limitations in this problem, and asking other sectors to help and collaboration. Rebecca Solnit explains in A Paradise Built in Hell that when people directly perceive dangers, such an extreme climatic phenomena, they are capable of organizing themselves and temporarily suspending their market dictatorship. Here you have images of the integration of the operational service of extinction into our academic courses. And there is something very relevant, common, and a common aspect between our discipline and firefighters. Firefighters are an operational corps that conducts research due to the need to incorporate new knowledge into their work, which also characterizes our profession. We are an operational discipline. We carry out work, we do research, and we also have civil and penal responsibilities. Landscape designers have a fundamental role in wildfire prevention policies, incorporating wildfire risk and vulnerability as a transversal aim in our strategies, revealing capacities and working together towards the socialization of risk. Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't hear you. I'm sorry.
Yes, so
No, yes.
thank you so much. Really excellent. I really love to learn about the paradox that we are facing today. So if there's any question from the students, let's see. Maybe I start with the one question regarding more the two aspects. First of all, those two projects you talk about, the grazing and the fire wine, are
Yes.
two pilot projects. What's the idea behind them? Is it part of a European project to extend to other sites or?
The fire Ramat Zefok, the fire shepherds, is a project that recognizes the existing stakeholders that are grazing and have cattle, but they add a strategic view on what they are already doing. Very often it costs a lot to have a herd and have economic profit. It is an activity which is quite difficult to have nowadays because of the competitive meat in supermarkets and everything. So recognizing the value of these cattle that are creating protection towards wildfire and giving visibility through trademarks and to consumers, it enhances, for example, the value, the recognition of the value. So this is a project that has that started about 4 or 5 years ago, as an initiative of the Pau Costa Foundation, was created in some pilot cases, but it is being spreading in the territory, even out from Catalonia and to Portugal, because it's a way of recognizing more value to this activity and even creating a self-sustaining activity, because if not, some of these activities would have stopped.
Okay. Okay. Clear. Thank you. Yes, you should come here, probably, because otherwise.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering what's the difference with the Mediterranean landscape? I mean, we are here in Virginia. Yeah, I happen to be from Mediterranean area, but the question is why this is different. And you showed us also what's happening in Sweden, and
Yes.
I would like your thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question. In the Mediterranean, fire has been integrated as a dynamic, as I was saying the word of pyroecology. It is because many of our species in the Mediterranean are already adapted to fire, and fire was part, I was quoting at the beginning, the first paradox, it is part of the dynamics of landscape. So in the Mediterranean context, there are some characteristics and some regimes in which wildfire is very much integrated. Now, with climate change, and when I mean Mediterranean context, I don't mean just the European Mediterranean context, but all the Mediterranean climate areas. For example, California, South Africa, Chile, and the Mediterranean region of Europe. So what is happening now with climate change scenario is that many other countries as well are suffering this dynamic in a higher intensity because of the situations we are facing of higher temperatures and all the changes that due to climate change. So, for example, in Sweden or in Germany or in Norway, they are facing new wildfire regimes. Here in the Mediterranean region, we have a culture and we have a culture and a history related to wildfires, and as well an expertise by now created in the last 20 years that can be exported to other regions, because these are new situations that other countries are facing and other regions are facing. We as well are facing new conditions in the Mediterranean because, as I was telling you, due to dynamic changes and the climate, we are facing new scenarios as well. So the whole world is facing new scenarios on wildfire and as well other disturbances, for example, floodings.
Any other question? May I ask? Yes.
Hi, thank you for that. That was great. I was curious if during the regeneration process, if in your experience you've run into any problems with invasive species taking over a landscape, and if there's any kind of maintenance that needs to be done after a fire regarding that.
Okay, thank you. It's an interesting question. Well, very often it's very interesting how to see how a species react to fire. Some of these invasive species are very resilient to wildfires. For example, we have here in Spain or in the Mediterranean some specific canes, Arundodonax. They are American canes. They have come from America, and they react in a very regenerative way. So fire doesn't distinguish very well if it is invasive or not. What it is as well true is that in our landscapes, our native species are very much adapted to wildfires. Maybe some invasive species can be as well adapted, but mainly the species that are in the landscape already or were autochthonous, they are very much high resilience species. But what has as well happened is, for example, we have pines in the Mediterranean region, which were adapted and resilient to fire. And now, because of climate change, they are having problems with some plagues, and they are much weak because of the changes of precipitation, of rain. So some of our native species are no longer resistant and resilient to wildfires.
Okay, great.
Yes,
Thank
so
you.
it's a complex issue. Yes,
Yeah,
completely.
thank you.
I have one last question about more representation, beautiful drawings that we have seen. I was wondering when you talk about, representing uncertainty, how you deal with your students, how they can detect and represent that.
Well, this is an issue, and it's interesting because at the beginning they have fear and they are quite like worried about how to do it. But then they start to face a new situation and they are really willing to join to this representation of uncertainty. And if we had more time, I would have shown you some of the results of some experiences and experiments we are doing with models and prototypes. And some of them are a little bit pyro freaks, and they love to explore these new scenarios because I think it opens a wide dimension of landscape that sometimes, if it is not through disturbances, we cannot really face them. So yeah, that's an interesting way of exploring landscape.
Excellent. Great. If there are no questions, well, thank you so much for your lecture. I really appreciate it,
welcome.
and we stay in touch for future
Yes, thank you
things.
very much. And yes, I hope we will be in touch and have a great weekend, everyone.
Yes, the same to you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye bye. Thank you.